Hello there, and welcome to Preprints in Motion, the podcast taking a deep dive in the fast-paced world of preprints.
Join us as we sit down with early career researchers, discuss their latest preprint, and find out about their journey through the muddy marshes of academia.
Hit that subscribe button, leave a rating, and support us by heading over to buymeacoffee.com/preprints. But for now, let's get into the show.
And we are back for 2025. And to celebrate the podcast returning, we've started with a brilliant episode all about the strain of scientific publishing. Well then, let's just jump straight into this. And I will try my very hardest not to be rusty and totally remember everything I used to do when I did these. And have a nice flowing conversation and not awkward pauses whilst I think of questions. Obviously I have read the paper. It's a really, really good paper. And the reason I wanted to have you on as our first one coming back, and I really appreciate the jumping on at short notice for this one, is because I think this really sets the stage for partly why the podcast is coming back. It helps me justify why I exist quite often. So it's nice to have a paper with data that I can point to for that, rather than just me telling people I'm definitely worth the money, I promise. So I thought it was a really, really good one to jump back in with. But maybe to start, why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us who you are, and then we'll jump on from there.
Sure. So my name is Mark Hanson. I'm a PI at the University of Exeter Penryn campus in the United Kingdom. I'm, by training, an immunologist and geneticist working with Drosophila fruit flies and infection biology. So I tend to stab them with bacteria-laced needles, and then I swear it's useful. And I am a hobbyist for scientific publishing reform.
That's kind of how I started out. My PhD was with fruit flies, and every now and then we would stab them with bacteria, but we were looking at wound healing, so we'd usually use a laser to shoot them.
Oh, that's fun.
Which is always cool as well. This all started as a bit of a hobby for me as well, and then eventually progressed into the other way around. So this is now my job, and the shooting flies is a hobby.
Oh, so you still do it, actually?
No, I know. A couple of years ago, I was trying to get a grant to do some lab work looking at glucanac and post-translational modifications on how the immune system functions, and that would have all been fruit fly based, but didn't get that.
Well, if you have a hankering, you know where to find me. We'll get you suited up.
I can still remember how to do it. When we go out for pub trips and I'm introduced to new people, one of my fun facts is I can sex and tell you whether your fly is a virgin or not, which the general public seem to be more impressed by than you would think.
Good to know.
So we're not here to talk about any of that, though. We're here to talk about the actual the publishing stuff you've been doing. And it's a really interesting paper because I think we all in science know that there's a problem and we're publishing too much and it's impossible to keep up with the literature, and there's a lot of complaints about that. But nobody seems to have actually gone out and quantified all that in a really nice, detailed way like you have. A good starting point is just to give us a quick overview of what you think your biggest main findings are. I mean, for me, it was that the thing that I really liked was that you showed not only are we getting this increase in amount of stuff being published, but you had that graph, it was one of your first graphs, where that line's going up and then the line of new PhDs is it's tailing off and going down in the opposite direction.
Yeah, so I guess what I'd say is we started out this project as a bunch of guys on Twitter, back when it was called Twitter. And we each had our own independent route to getting to this question of the strain on scientific publishing. And it started a bit with invitations from groups like Multidisciplinary Publishing Institute, like MDBI, and Frontiers Media, which hosts a number of journals named Frontiers in something. And we also have watched the proliferation of journals by groups like Springer Nature and Elsevier. And alongside that, there's been a lot of public discourse, water cooler chat and social media chat about researchers being overworked, peer reviewers doing too much and not getting any compensation for it. And there were some really high-profile editor resignations like editors resigning en masse as an entire editorial board, leaving a journal in the lurch. And those aren't signs of a healthy system. And so we set out to quantify what was going on with all of this stress that was facing the scientific publishing landscape. And one of the first things we found was just that there was this massive proliferation of papers in the last few years that has vastly outpaced the number of scientists actually doing the research. And so that's probably why people were feeling so stressed and so overworked.
Yeah, it is amazing how recent that is as well. And I think, MDPI and Frontiers get a lot of the flack for this, but as you show, it's not just them. So your paper proposes two different mechanisms for why this increase is happening. So you've got just a lot more publications from individual journals, but also the other route of distribution across a whole bunch of new journals. And the estimates of how many journals there are is quite hard to really pin down, but it's anywhere from like 20,000 to something like 100,000. I mean, when you look at that, do you think one route is worse than the other, or are they just both as problematic as each other?
I think they're rivaling each other. I think they're quite comparable. And just as some stats behind that, at the start of our data set, we collected our data from the Scopus database via SciMago. I think it was in 1999 or 2000. There were about 10,000 journals. You can double check this. I might get some years wrong, but the sentiment is correct. So there was about 10,000 journals at the start, and there was about 22,000 journals in 2022. And so that is a massive proliferation of journals compared to the number of people in the world, for instance, the number of practicing scientists in the world.
Yeah, we basically have one each.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I hadn't thought about it that way, but now that you mention it. But we also did see this huge rise in papers published by specific journals. And those journals were hosted by specific groups. So you see a huge proliferation of papers by groups like Multidisciplinary Publishing Institute. I'll just say MDPI for the rest of the podcast. And Frontiers, and groups like Hindawi, which was an Egyptian publisher that's now been sunset by its parent company, who bought it in 2021.
In a bizarre business decision there.
Yeah, I think they bit off more than they realized they were chewing. That's a whole side conversation about Wiley and ethics, and to their credit, they did what I view as kind of the right thing. They detected a lot of fraud, and they detected a lot of suspicious activity, and they said, well, we got to shut this down. Even if we just spent millions of dollars on this, we cannot, for the sake of the scientific discourse, we cannot keep this appearing legitimate. So kudos to them on that one.
And sort of staying on MDPI and Frontiers, one of the things we see they do that perhaps the more traditional publishers don't do are special issues. And special issues, I think, has been the other thing that has really risen a huge amount, definitely in the last 10 years. I don't know how many special issues there were in sort of like the 2000s, 2010s, because I wasn't a scientist then. I was still a student. But it feels like it's been a huge growth in a very short space of time.
Yeah, well, it's kind of funny because, we can find, in presenting this work and researching this, we can provide documents from the Middle Ages where someone is complaining about how there's too much literature out there to possibly read it all. And this seems to be a common complaint. But there are people from 2007. I think there's a discourse I remember the author is Priem 2007. And they have a paper titled, "Let's Make Special Issues Special Once Again," almost eerily projecting for 10 years down the line. And so this is also not something unique, that there has been this growth in special issues, and it's a bit oxymoronic, right? Because special issues contains the word special, unique, not normal, not the norm. And yet somehow, over the last 10 years, but not even, over the course of about 4 years, special issues really took on a different meaning because some groups just massively inflated the number of papers that they were publishing via this special issue engine of growth. And I think that MDPI and Frontiers get a lot of flack for this, and rightly so on that front. But I would also say that we haven't been able to collect those data for groups like Elsevier in the same way. And for all we know, Elsevier has not just inflated the number of journals they have over the course of the study period, but they might also have a special issue signature that we just can't get at because the data are not publicly available.
I mean, the thing you did with this data is you've relied on indexed journals. So if anything, you're actually underestimating the extent of the problem. And this guy, it brings us to the question of eLife and all the stuff that they've been going through over the past 12 months. So how do you think those kind of changes are going to impact what you've seen here? Do you think things like eLife and, I guess the move towards preprinting is going to... A lot of people complain about preprints as being these things that are just going to add more to the literature, and it's going to be more problematic. Is that how you see things going?
No, I don't think it is. So I'll actually jump back very briefly to the special issue notion for a second, because I don't know if you do links in the podcast, but I've got a blog post discussing sort of what a special issue used to mean versus what a special issue means to some publishers now. And it's just a night and day difference. And so I think what's happened is that publishers hijacked the phrasing special issue to publish something that's very different from what we used to call a special issue. And I think that's part of how they came to grow out of control, because they were taking this infrastructure that existed, but was reserved for very special circumstances. And they took the brakes off they slammed the pedal to the metal. And when you don't have those reservations, that system enables a lot of growth. And so to your question on preprints, I don't think that preprints contribute to growth in the same way. So I don't think preprints are straining the literature in the same way because they're not de facto peer reviewed. And that to me is a positive, because part of the strain we're seeing is that we have this model that's a bit old-fashioned and not adapted for an internet era, especially in the age of AI, but we'll get to that. But we have this model that was built on the idea that papers take a long time to assess, and that, starting in the 1960s, 1970s, major journals began doing peer review by standard. And, this is the Preprints in Motion podcast. I assume people know what peer review is, but it's worth saying that the modern concept of peer review is not something that's always been around. Papers were not peer reviewed until the mid 1960s, 1970s. Einstein famously got upset that one of his papers was peer reviewed, and he retracted his submission from the journal and sent it somewhere else. He was so offended by the notion that some editor would deem his work needing to be checked before it was published. And that story has a caveat, because the editor was probably the colleague down the hall, and the peer reviewer, the anonymous peer reviewer, was probably also the same person who just disagreed with him and was probably right about it.
Yeah.
So peer review has its place too. But that system is built on this notion of journals being this physical thing, this magazine that has a artificial scarcity to what they can publish. And so peer review was something you could manage because you had a set number of pages that you were going to publish, and you had a set number of papers you were going to consider. But come the internet era and this digital repository that's nearly infinite, peer review has been applied using the old rules, and suddenly we're trying to peer review the entire sum of humanity's attempts at, generating knowledge. And it's too much.
Yeah.
And so I think preprints are this great tool, because it's this way to publish something as a finalized, even if not everyone views it that way right now, it says this has reached a point where we're willing to finalize this in some form. It is now ready for public consumption, but you do not need to peer review this right now.
Yeah.
And I think if we view it that way, it's a very positive thing.
I always like when other people say these things, because I feel like I bang on about it all the time and people get sick of hearing me say it. So maybe you just explain preprints. Maybe it's also good to just step back and talk about why special issues are different to just a normal journal publication. Because, you highlighted a few things in your article as to why they're different. Maybe those are some good things to talk about as well, because I don't think everyone listening will necessarily know what the real difference between a special issue is and just a standard issue.
Yeah, totally. So a regular journal article is something where you're basically cold calling the journal. You submit your research to the journal and you say, hey, we think we did something really interesting. Would you consider this for publication? And the journal has an editor that handles the article. And the editor takes a look at it and assesses whether or not it's worth spending more time on. And if they like it, if they think it's interesting, they'll send it out for peer review and they'll coordinate that. That's their job. And then they'll get those reviews back from enlisted peer reviewers who are ideally experts in the field. And the editor will take some information, the article itself, which hopefully they've at least glanced over, and also the comments from the reviewers, and make a judgment call about whether it's worth publishing this, what work it needs to be done before it gets published, or whether this needs to go back to the drawing board and get rejected. Special issues, on the other hand, typically take the form of a guest editor coming in to edit articles for a journal. And so that guest editor is doing the legwork for publishing the articles. And what they do is they collect a bunch of articles under a theme, some research question that is ideally topical, important, special. And so I like to highlight philosophical transactions of the Royal Society. I have experience with B, the biological sciences version. But philosophical transactions, this is a journal that started in 1665. And so they have been around through the ages, and the way that they coordinate a special issue is you meet people at conferences. You have a booth set up, or you manage to meet someone through some other networking means, and you get chatting, and you say that there's this really interesting topic right now. There's been a lot of exciting papers out recently, and you are a leader in that field in some form. You probably published some of those exciting papers, and maybe this field is coming to a head where it's good to sit down and really have a conversation about where it's going in the next 10 years and provide that guidance to the broader community. And a special issue is a way that you could do that. You could have a bunch of opinion articles and review articles and even original research that gets published through this to help guide people's thinking and collect your thoughts as a community. And so the way PhilTransB does it is you actually submit your concept of a special issue as a pre-submission consideration. And the total text that goes into that is about 15 pages, give or take. And that's because there's going to be a few pages of you justifying why it's special, why it's topical, why it's interesting, why it's important. Also, why this is a topic where articles being published deserve to be published together rather than individually. What that special issue process is going to give to these articles that they wouldn't get if they were just published independently. And then you also are supposed to contact potential authors. You reach out to your network of colleagues and you say, I'm putting this issue together and I'd like you to write something for it because I think you did really great work in the last few years. And they submit abstracts for what paper they would publish, if given the chance. And so you submit all of that to PhilTransB, and that's what they consider a year or more in advance before they give you the green light on this. And they actually have a 50% rejection rate for special issue concepts. So just because you do all this work, it doesn't guarantee that you're going to get the opportunity. They're still one of the groups printing a physical magazine, so they do 26 per year, and that artificial scarcity creates this need to select the best. So they cannot publish everything they receive as a submission. They've got to cut somewhere. And so that is a process of selection that tries to promote the most interesting, the most special, the most impactful, the most organized ideas. And so that is how a special issue is formed at one of the oldest societies, the oldest publishers in the world. Why I said earlier that special issues had been hijacked is because the modern definition of a special issue, there's kind of these two versions. One is this sort of thought-provoking water cooler conversation. That's the one I just described by PhilTrans, where you get people together and you've had a chat and you think it's really interesting. And the other one I've been calling Frankenstein special issues. Keeping in mind, Frankenstein was the doctor and not the monster. Frankenstein special issues are these things that are cobbled together from independent parts. And so they're not necessarily bad. eLife, for instance, has hosted Frankenstein special issues. It's an open call for papers where you say, we'd like you to submit your work on this topic, and we're actively inviting papers for discussion on this. And done well, those can also be really good. Something beautiful can come from what Mary Shelley first theorized. But the alternative side of that is groups like MDPI. I compare these two because I said, Philtrans, you have to submit something like 15 pages of text. MDPI, in order to propose a special issue, you submit about 200 words of what your concept is, and then you submit either a list of abstract or names of 20 authors who might submit an article. And nowhere does it say that those authors need to have actually talked to you in advance. It's just 20 names that you can throw out with emails. And that's it. That's the whole thing. At that point, MDPI takes over and they say, great, we'll happily help you organize a special issue on this. In fact, we will offer to help recruit papers to your special issue. And I've been on the receiving end of this where someone forgot to put the email list in the BCC. And so I was one of 150 plus people that got invited to contribute an article to this special issue. And because I'm cheeky, I responded, actually, I have an interesting preprint out right now that might be relevant to this invitation. And I sent the link in a PDF, and they said, oh, if you want to submit that through the formal thing, that would be great so that we can have a proper look. They don't care. They don't actually read what I'm writing, They just send out mass emails hoping people will send them work. And they publish it under the guest editor. Who said, yeah, I have an idea for a special issue. I'm not even clear what the guest editor is doing at MDPI. I presume they see manuscripts at some point, but I think they just get sent to them to make decisions,
And I mean, this is ultimately what's led to the special issues in these kind of special issues anyway, as having lower rejection rates, seemingly often lower quality, although I don't like saying that without there being data behind that, but anecdotally, I think you can definitely say lower quality. And also, what I found very interesting that you found was increasingly homogeneous turnaround times and shortening turnaround times in a lot of the cases. Now, COVID, I think, brought turnaround times up a lot in terms of thinking about peer review, and well, you can't possibly peer review a paper in 2 days. But with a special issue, you could maybe understand, if you've done it as philosophical transactions do, then you could understand why there might be a slightly quicker turnaround time once you've got everything together, because you've seen abstract, you've kind of got the idea of what this whole special issue might look like. Is there anything we could do to change any of that with special issues, other than just not join in with the effort?
No, and I think that's built into the point of a special issue. It's not a bad thing intrinsically that special issues have lower turnaround times. That's something we found across publisher groups. Not just MDPI, but even Springer. I think Springer Nature was the outlier, but PLOS, Wiley, BMC, Elsevier. Not sure we had Elsevier there. But it was uniform, and I think Philtrans B, for sure, I would expect them to have lower turnaround times than sister journals that publish articles through the regular process. But the reason for that is if you keep the brakes on, if you keep the guardrails up, your meritocratic, your selection process for what gets written is based on selection by a qualified editor who's saying this is someone who's done something really exciting. And so the pre-selection process already has taken the people that are most likely to produce work that doesn't need tons of editing. But if you open the guardrail, or if you open the floodgates, how many analogies have I used about this now? If you open the floodgates, then it's a bit of a mess because not everything is equal. That was the striking thing about the MDPI data is every journal they have, independent of subject, independent of model organism, independent of whether you're studying physics or chemistry or biology or economics or mathematics, it doesn't matter because everything in MDPI gets published in about 37 days, plus or minus 5 days. And it's impossible that is justified because say we were talking about fruit flies earlier. One of the strengths of using fruit flies as a model is that if someone requests you do additional experiments, you can do additional experiments in fruit flies in a few weeks. The flies take 10 days to grow. You can very rapidly piece together very complex genetic experiments with them. And so you have a lot of power to do exactly what you need. But if you're a mouse researcher and someone says, you need to do more experiments with these mice before we publish this, the mice are going to take 7 to 8 weeks to grow. And there's going to be ethics concerns that you have to navigate. And you're going to have to do multiple replicates of this experiment, right? So additional experiments in fruit flies might take you an extra couple months. But with mice, it might take you 6 months or more to just answer the reviewer requests. So how can you possibly publish both of those in 37 days from first submission to final acceptance?
Yeah.
It's mind-boggling.
Yeah, after my PhD, I went to my mouse work, and it was just such a miserable experience in comparison. I missed the flies on basically a daily basis. They was just so much easier to work with, quicker. Also, I must say that the fly community is amazing. If you want anything, you just have to ask around, and someone will probably have what you want, and they'll just give it to you. They're lovely people. Mice, horrible to work with.
I'll take it. I 100% agree. And not to be a favoritist, although flies are the best, but not to be a favoritist, yeast or bacteria are even easier than flies. Nematodes too. You can freeze them. Flies are the one model organism you can't freeze in any format. So if you want to do an experiment with a bacteria or a yeast culture, just pull it out of the freezer, and then a couple weeks later, you got all your data. So
yeah,
I'm probably being way too generous to them.
I've got a friend who he started his lab recently, and he works on basically it's protein synthesis that he does. So he's got cell lines. It does really cool things with certain proteins in those cell lines, but it can he can basically work quicker than the fly researchers can, depending on exactly what he's doing. And he's already published his first paper from his lab. It's just amazing how quick it is. And the really weird thing is, in academia, we judge everyone equally. So you can work that quickly, or you can have mouse stuff I was doing for my last postdoc, which was a year and a half ago I left that. Still not ready. The mouse line we used ended up being lost, so they've had to restart it up, and that's 6+ months worth of work. It was already 6 months worth of work to get it in, because we had to get it in. So there's a year, just one mouse line, not even the rest of it, and characterization or anything like that. So going back to these very homogeneous turnaround times and moving away from complaining about mice. The other thing you found that I thought was really striking, and again, this is very much sort of an MDPI thing here, is that you were looking at impact factors, and you came up with this impact factor inflation, and MDPI were very much a clear outlier there as well in terms of how that was. So could you just talk about what that is and why that's really useful? Yeah,
absolutely. And I think earlier you mentioned quality, and it's very difficult to quantify this. Quality is a squishy word that it's very hard to say anything objective about. So this was actually my attempt back in 2020, I think, to get at what the conversation in the social media was talking about. Is there any noticeable difference between groups? And one of the ways I could do that in a systematic fashion was compare the impact factor of a journal, which is the total citations that an article receives on average over usually 2 years in that journal. Taking that, so it's roughly total citations per article. That's the key point. It's total citations per article. Take that and divide it by something that's network adjusted. And so Scopus, their database, is distributed by SciMago, which has their own journal rank indicator called the SciMago Journal Rank. And so unlike Impact Factor, which just uses total citations, the SciMago Journal Rank, it takes this network approach. And so it says, not only do articles from these journals get cited a lot, but it asks, where are those citations coming from? And are they from the same field? Are they from a different field entirely? And so they're kind of a token citation. Are they coming from journals that lots of people cite, or are they coming from these niche journals that almost nobody pays attention to? How many of the citations are coming from the journal itself? You know, how many of that, when I say self-citation here, I'm referring to within journal citation. So that is, if you've got a really high self-citation rate, it means that most of the time, no one's reading your articles except for the people publishing in that journal itself, which probably means it's circular and probably even the same authors doing the citing of each other in a ring. So when you have a really high impact factor, it's seen broadly by the world. Some people are catching on to this, but a high impact factor is seen as a positive. It's seen as something like, wow, this is getting lots of citations, and so it's clearly useful and important. But the SCImago journal rank, it has these built-in control measures to say, okay, we will reward a certain level of self-citation, but past a certain point, we'll stop letting that contribute to our score. And in fact, we'll also, by virtue of the network approach, if you're journal A and you're citing journal B all the time, you can also only contribute so much value to journal B's rank from journal A alone. You have to pull in other journals that cite journal B if we want to have a high score for journal B. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So this network approach, it's a way to control these self-citations, but it's also a way to control across journals. There's actually a term for this. It's called citation cartels or ring citations, where groups of authors publishing in just a few journals, they tend to excessively cite themselves or their buddies, but to avoid getting detected, they distribute those articles across multiple journals, and so they reduce the rate of self-citation in terms of raw numbers. But the SCImago journal rank captures that. So I reasoned, just take the impact factor, the total citations, and divide it by the SCImago journal rank. And if you're pulling in lots of citations from a diversity of sources, as you'd expect of an article that has broad appeal, then those two will be roughly proportional. But if your total citations are coming from a very small network of journals, you will not be rewarded proportionally for your citations, because you're going to have these caps on total rank value that the SCImago journal rank allows you from journal A, for instance. And so using that, you can show these outliers. And that's where MDPI was this crazy outlier, and also Hindawi. They had this really high impact inflation compared to other publishers.
Question people keep asking me. I was at OASPA, the Open Access Publishers Conference this year. And what really struck me while I was there was that a lot of people kept saying, well, it's their fault. So if you were talking to a journal, they would say, well, it's the funder's fault. If you were talking to a funder, they'd blame the journal or the researcher. If you're talking to a researcher, they'd blame the funder or the journal. And there's a lot of finger pointing and nobody taking any responsibility for any of it. I was giving a talk, and I decided to incorporate that in my talk. So I got up on stage and blamed everyone I could think of who was in the audience.
Perfect.
Which went down well. And then immediately followed up with, well, actually, we're kind of all to blame because we're all playing our part in this. I mean, in the paper, you break it down into sort of funders, publishers, researchers, and it's that the strain is that interaction of those three, which is a nice way of putting it, because it very much is. I guess the question is, can any one of those take lead on making things better, or is it that we really do need everyone to come together and work together? Because the big problem, of course, is no one talks to each other at the moment.
Yeah, I'd say there is one group that's got more sway than they let on, and it's the funders. Just to be clear, when we talk about funders, we actually lump in universities with that, because they're the ones hiring people for long-term positions. So they are funding the research, just not through grants, but rather career security. And the funders, they can make hiring decisions and they can make grant awarding decisions independently from the journals. And they don't need published work to make their decision. They can choose to fund work that they find interesting. And I think they're caught in a bit of a self-limiting cycle, because we've had this push to prevent bias. And it's a very positive thing. It's a very good thing to be thinking about. But as a consequence of that, we are increasingly encouraged to fund based on merit. And how do you judge merit in an objective way? You've got to come up with some sort of score for researchers. And for a long time, people were tempted to use impact factor of a journal to judge the worth of an article if it had just been published. Articles that were a few years old, you could judge for themselves because they would have a citation trail and people would have talked about them if they were interesting. But stuff that was just published, the exciting, at the forefront of knowledge work, you just have to wing it in terms of understanding whether this is really impactful or not. So you outsource your judgment of those articles to the journals. And you say, okay, if it's a high impact factor journal, it's a journal that typically attracts a lot of attention, a lot of high profile research. And so we'll treat this as if it's a high profile article and we expect it to be that. So there was a justification for doing that, flawed as it may be. But it's just too difficult to judge hundreds of applications, each of which are incredibly nuanced and a lot of them excellent. It's too much to ask a small panel of people to award funding in any sort of meritocratic way without outsourcing some of those tie-breaking decisions to metrics. And so now there's a lot of discussion about metrics and trying to find the right ones to help delineate. And I think it's fundamentally a necessary conversation, but it's also a bit misguided, if I can say it. I think we just got to go towards more randomness, if I'm honest.
I'm glad you said that, because that's what I was about to follow up with. I also agree that the funders have a lot more power and sway than they'd like to let on. And I would love to see grants and fellowship coming down to, at a certain point, just a lottery. Because it is difficult to whittle things down, but once you do, you really are making just impossible decisions, because there's always going to be more great ideas that are fundable and are perfectly reasonable to fund than you can fund. And the fairest way I can see of doing that is through a lottery system.
Yeah, I mean, I 100% agree. I think there's been pushes to things like narrative CVs as well, which are positive. Instead of, there's the concept of publish or perish. For people who don't know, this is this rat race that researchers find themselves in, where you need to publish more papers to get more papers on your CV to make yourself look more self-important and impressive. And narrative CVs are this way of saying, okay, don't give us your laundry list of papers that you've been on. Just give us your top 3 or your top 5 and write us a paragraph explaining why this is a useful paper and why it's important and why you've highlighted it as some of your premier work. And that's a very positive way to cut down on these box ticking, bean counting metrics and instead focus on what arguments the person can put forth themselves. But like you say, past a certain point, there's always going to be more fundable stuff than you have funding for. And I know, for instance, the NIH did a pilot program where they were awarding grants after a certain cutoff point. They said, we're just going to award these by lottery. And so, maybe there's 30 total grants available. They put 60 into a bingo wheel and 60 grants into a bingo wheel, and they spin it and they figure out which ones are going to succeed.
You can see the game show in your mind, can't you, already forming, with some big name scientist on a stage doing a little wheel.
Yeah, they better have an actual wheel. I've been privy to a randomizer, a number randomizer list, and boy, was it anticlimactic. You press one button and then the whole list spits out and you just go, okay, where am I? You got to make a show of this. But yeah, past a certain point. So that number 60 is not a fixed number, right? You could have 67 that you just say, these are all equally good. And any minutia that we would judge on is just up to who's doing the judging rather than the actual merit of the science. So I had a colleague that submitted to one of the first rounds of this pilot program, and he ultimately was not funded. And he said it was the best rejection he's ever received. He was at peace.
Yeah.
Because he knew he was good enough. He had done everything he could, and he was fundable. And the only thing that got in his way was luck.
Yeah, it's a really nice way of looking at it. I hadn't thought about that. But that is a really nice byproduct of that randomization part, because now you've turned it from that viewpoint of I'm not good enough to, well, I was.
100%. And by doing that, you also prevent this rat race feeling of, okay, I got rejected, but I was just on the bubble. What can I do? Where can I toggle the lines to make myself more fundable next time? And that's a crapshoot if I've ever seen one. You have no control over that. It's entirely up to who's doing the reviewing of your grant. whether you get an 8 or a 9, that kind of stuff you have almost no control over. So just don't, just leave those fine-tuning points to a lottery. And I think there's challenges to that too. But they're easily tackleable, right? You can just make sure that if you've received a grant by lottery, you don't have an equal chance to get one next year from the same funding body. And if you didn't get one, but you were fundable last year, maybe you get split into a pool of people that has a higher chance, so that you're not constantly applying and just constantly having a string of bad luck that keeps you from having a career, There are ways to mitigate those problems, but I think a lottery is fundamentally the way we need to go about this.
So I've just remembered what format this podcast is meant to take. 50 minutes in. And I meant to ask questions about your experience of academia. So we're just going to very abruptly jump onto that whilst we've got a bit of time left. But I think maybe a nice way into that is actually, you're an immunologist working with fruit flies in the day. And then this thing you've done almost as a hobby alongside of that. How do you find that balance? Because I know a lot of people, certainly new PIs who are just starting out, they're very focused on doing the lab work, getting that out, and I guess that rat race, the sort of career aspect of it. And they see things like publishing a paper about publishing as a distraction. I mean, I've been told it's a distraction when I was still in academia. How do you find that balance of deciding where to spend your time? Why do you spend your time split like that?
I wish I could tell you that I found a balance, but I did not. No, I mean, late nights working on this stuff. I quit my day job and then I started working on a night job that didn't even pay me anything. We have in our acknowledgements, and I love that we got to put this. This was a labor of love, and it was not externally funded. We are just 4 white guys who were vocal on the internet about a problem that we saw, and we're very honest and open about this because part of this strain too, I should say, is there are initiatives out there to bring in the global south into the scientific community, and those are very good initiatives, and that's a totally independent, separate thing from what we're talking about. Fundamentally, it's not about where something comes from. It's not where these arguments or articles are coming from. It's about the quality of the research and the integrity of the scientific record and public trust in science too. There's a really damaging aspect to polluting the scientific literature with a bunch of low quality work, because it means that peer-reviewed science no longer means what it did before. And it allows a lot of people to champion a cause that is scientifically unsound, but they can point to a peer-reviewed article that supports them in the same way that they used to be able to point to a blog post. And that's really scary.
There are benefits to just lying and cheating.
No, but I didn't find a balance in this. We were just passionate about this problem, and I think we just got so fed up with the lack of direction that the conversation was taking. One of the reasons I got so interested in this is because I was invited to publish in a research topic from Frontiers Media in their flagship journal, Frontiers in Immunology, and it was at a conference. It was a Gordon Research Conference. The conference organizer and major guy in the field was the editor and inviting calls for papers. And so we put one forward. And only after I published in this did I find out the broader perspective of what people view Frontiers as. At the time, they were talking about MDPI and Frontiers in the same breath. And that was very common on social media. And every time you saw a poll on Twitter, it was just like, is MDPI a predatory journal? Yes or no? And of course, everyone said yes, because it's a completely biased poll. So actually what started my interest was I put out a series of polls in a slightly more scientific manner where I asked, is MDPI a predatory publisher? Yes, very much so. Yes, quasi-predatory. No, but a little sketchy. Or no, not at all. And then I asked the exact same question for Frontiers. And I asked the exact same question for Biomed Central, BMC, which is the same gold open access publishing model, but they do not show the same tendencies. And then I asked it about PLOS, Public Library of Science. And they are a not-for-profit open access publisher. And when I asked that question, 25% of people said, yeah, PLOS is a predatory publisher, which gives you perspective, right, about what the internet is saying. And so I just found that fascinating, that this conversation had become so distorted that 25% of people out there willing to click on a poll about scientific publishing felt like a not-for-profit was predatory. And so that drove me to try and quantify exactly what was going on and try and paint a clearer picture of what was going on. And this is what came out of it, you know?
The thing I really like is that it's not coming from the meta-science community, because as time has been going on, the past few years, the meta-science space has really grown up a bit, and there's a lot more people active in that space asking these kind of questions. But there's still overwhelmingly psychologists asking questions about biology, and it just doesn't quite work. I've always found that any paper I've ever read, there's always issues, there's always something where they're bringing the viewpoint and not understanding the lab work, for example. So like people talk about replication a lot as a big solution to everything ever. And I don't think they understand that biology inherently is not, you can't repeat, biology is not meant to be replicatable. You can repeat experiments to a degree, but I've joined labs and I've not been able to repeat what the PI's done. And it's not because either of us has done anything wrong. It's just the biology is ever so slightly different. Or, I used to work with looking at cell responses to hypoxia. And the moment you take those cells out of the hypoxia hood, it depends how quickly you get your experiment done as to what result you get, more than anything else.
100%.
And am I timing that? I'm not. Also, the cell density matters more than anyone, or the amount of media you put on top of your cells. And these have more impact than like anything else in that experiment does. So I think it's a bit of a lost cause, really. But it's really nice that you're biologists, you're actually doing the lab work, and you're also looking at this and thinking about this side of stuff and providing that kind of data, because I think we need a lot more of that. I always find people, at least in my experience, the people I talk to who are just pure biologists, they don't spend enough time thinking about why they publish or peer review or do anything the way they do it. They just see it as, I do that, I've got to do that. And it is so nice to actually see not just people engaging in that more, but actually researching it and really adding to it.
Thank you. Yeah, and I would give a shout out to the groups of Vincent Lariviere, Stephanie Haustein, Leanne Butler just had a paper out that are also tackling some of these tough questions and really exposing these monetary aspects of the strain that we don't get to talk about. Because we focused our data on really publicly available, but not necessarily easily collected data. But the one thing we couldn't talk about is the profit motive behind it. And they've done a really good job on that. So just to get that in there, you should really check out their work.
We might have them on, actually. I've done a lot of social media tweeting about their work. But it's fascinating work. It's the money is incredible. If you're going to start a new business, start a journal. Anyway, I will end it there because we are at time. Thank you so much for coming on and for this being our first episode back. It was a really, really great conversation.
Thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Good. That's what we aim for.
And that's the show, folks. If you enjoyed listening, then hit that subscribe button to get the latest updates straight to wherever it is you're listening. Don't forget to rate us on Spotify. Until next time, have a good week.
This podcast was produced by Rippling Ideas, turning ideas into waves.